At her mom's funeral, Adalyn thought she was saying goodbye to the past. But when her stepdad revealed he sold their cherished family cabin to cover his gambling debts, everything changed. What Adalyn didn't know, karma was waiting just around the corner, ready to strike back in ways no one could imagine. If this story already has your curiosity piqued, leave a 1 in the comments, or let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to follow Adalyn's incredible journey and discover what happens when justice takes an unexpected turn. A low-hanging gray sky pressed down on the mountain town of Ashwood, Oregon, mirroring the weight in Adalyn Harper's chest. The faint drizzle that coated the air blurred the line between the heavens and the mountains, a reflection of her muddled emotions. Outside the small weathered church, mourners huddled in clusters, their low voices blending with the whisper of the evergreen trees swaying in the cold wind. The simple steeple rose skyward, a quiet testament to her mother's faith, a faith Adalyn could never quite embrace, though she had often marveled at its power. Adalyn lingered on the outskirts of the churchyard, her black coat tightly buttoned against the chill. Her hands were buried deep in her pockets as she stared at the faded wooden cross above the door. A pang of guilt struck her as memories surfaced, her mother teaching Sunday school, her voice gentle yet commanding, or the way she'd light up during potluck dinners, effortlessly bridging the town's warmth with her own. Adalyn's breath hitched as the nostalgia collided with the rawness of her loss. She wasn't ready to step inside, not yet. The faint sound of laughter broke her reverie, jarring in the somber atmosphere. She turned her head slightly, catching sight of Richard Kessler among a small group of mourners. His over-polished demeanor stood in stark contrast to the flannel jackets and weathered boots of the townsfolk. His tailored overcoat and shiny shoes looked like they belonged in the lobby of a corporate office, not here. Even from a distance, Adalyn could see the practiced ease of his gestures as he shared a hushed joke, the kind that left the group smiling reluctantly, unsure whether to laugh or walk away. Her stomach tightened. Adalyn had always known Richard was good at charming people. He had that unshakable confidence that seemed to disarm even the most wary. It was part of what had drawn her mother to him in the first place, but to Adalyn that charm was nothing more than a veneer, masking the selfish, manipulative man she'd come to know too well. Adalyn. His voice carried over the damp air, smooth as glass but sharp enough to slice through her thoughts. She flinched involuntarily as he approached, weaving through the thinning crowd with calculated ease. She hadn't exchanged more than a few words with him since she arrived, hoping to keep her distance. Yet here he was. Richard's smile was as practiced as ever. "It was a nice service, wasn't it?" he said, stopping beside her. His voice carried the same oily politeness she had grown to despise. "Your mother would have loved the turnout. All these people, all this attention, it's touching." Adalyn's jaw tightened. She didn't trust herself to speak, so she focused on the church instead, willing him to leave. But Richard pressed on, leaning closer as though they were sharing a secret. "I suppose you'll be heading back soon, busy as always, saving the planet or whatever it is you do." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She refused to rise to the bait, but the glint in his eye suggested he was fishing for something. A reaction, perhaps, or an opportunity to steer the conversation in his favor. "I've been handling things here," Richard continued, his tone light but calculated. He waved a hand as though his role in settling her mother's affairs was some grand sacrifice. "You know, tying up loose ends?" Adalyn turned to face him, her brows knitting together. "What's that supposed to mean?" He smiled then, a small, calculated curve of his lips that sent a shiver of unease down her spine. "Well, I figured you'd want to know. I sold the cabin." The words hung in the air like a slap. For a moment, Adalyn could only stare at him, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and fury. "You did what?" "The cabin," Richard repeated, his tone maddeningly casual. "It's gone. Sold it last week." Adalyn felt the world tilt slightly, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. The cabin wasn't just a building. It was summers spent chasing fireflies, winters huddled by the fireplace, and a sanctuary untouched by Richard's influence. It was her mother's legacy, her sanctuary. "You had no right," she said, her voice shaking with restrained anger. "That cabin wasn't yours to sell." Richard shrugged, his expression maddeningly indifferent. "It was just sitting there. You're never around to use it, and I needed the money. We all make sacrifices." "Sacrifices?" Her voice rose, sharp and cutting. A few remaining mourners turned to glance in their direction, their quiet murmurs falling silent. Adalyn didn't care. "You mean you sold my mother's legacy to settle your gambling debts?" Richard's smile faltered, though he tried to recover. "Now don't be dramatic," he said, his tone defensive. "It's not like you've done much with it. Besides, the sale's done. No use crying over spilled milk." Adalyn stared at him, her breath coming in shallow bursts as anger and grief churned violently inside her. For a fleeting moment, she thought about her mother, how much she had endured because of this man, and now, this, her sanctuary gone with a wave of his hand. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low but firm, the quiet intensity cutting through the chilly air. Without another word, she turned on her heel and strode away, the crunch of gravel beneath her boots punctuating each step. As she reached her car, she paused, gripping the door handle tightly. The faint murmur of the remaining mourners drifted through the air, but her mind was miles away, back at the cabin where the walls still echoed with laughter and the warmth of her mother's smile. A single thought burned in her mind, sharper than the cold wind biting at her skin. Richard would not get away with this. Adalyn closed her eyes, letting the cool evening breeze of Ashwood stir memories she had tucked away long ago. The gentle rustling of the evergreens and the faint hum of crickets transported her back to summer nights at the cabin. She could almost hear her mother's voice, warm and soothing, calling her out to the porch. Together, they would sit under a canopy of stars, the fireflies blinking in a mesmerizing dance around them. Her mother would point to the constellations, spinning tales of ancient myths and leaving young Adalyn in awe of the vastness of the universe. The cabin wasn't just a home, it was a sanctuary, a place where time seemed to slow, allowing the weight of the world to fall away. Adalyn could still picture her mother in the kitchen, leaning over the counter with her hands dusted in flour as they baked pies together. The aroma of cinnamon and sugar would fill the air, mingling with their laughter. Every corner of the cabin held a memory, a moment untouched by the chaos that Richard would later bring into their lives. Richard. The name snapped her back to the present, and the warmth of the memory was replaced by a sharp ache in her chest. How dare he take that place, her mother's legacy, and reduce it to nothing more than a pawn in his reckless games? The thought ignited a simmering anger, pushing her to action. Without hesitation, she grabbed her phone and dialed the only person she trusted to help her, Tessa McAllister. "Adalyn!" Tessa's voice came through the line, as vibrant as ever. It was a blend of warmth and unshakable resolve that instantly put Adalyn at ease. "I was just about to call you. I heard about your mom. I'm so sorry." "Thanks, Tess," Adalyn replied softly, her throat tightening. "I wish I could say that's the only thing on my mind, but Richard, he's gone too far this time." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "What did he do now?" Tessa's tone shifted, laced with a fiery determination that Adalyn had always admired. Adalyn explained everything: the funeral, Richard's smug revelation, and the shock that still lingered. By the time she finished, Tessa's fury was palpable, each word crisp and deliberate. "He sold the cabin?" she repeated, her disbelief quickly giving way to righteous anger. "Does he even remember our co-ownership agreement? Legally, he can't sell it without my consent." "That's what I thought," Adalyn replied, relief trickling in at Tessa's confidence. "But knowing Richard, he's probably forged something or found some other way to manipulate the system." "Well, he picked the wrong fight," Tessa said firmly. "I'll pull up the paperwork first thing tomorrow and see exactly what he's trying to pull. If there's any forgery or shady dealings, we'll find it." Adalyn let out a shaky breath. Tessa's determination was as fierce as her loyalty, a combination that had seen them through more than one crisis over the years. "Thanks, Tess. I can't let him win this. That cabin, it's not just a house, it's—" "I know," Tessa interjected gently, her voice softening. "It's your mom's legacy, and yours. We're going to fight for it, Adalyn, but you have to be ready. Richard's not the type to go down without a fight." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Adalyn nodded, though Tessa couldn't see her. "I'll do whatever it takes." "You're stronger than him," Tessa said with certainty. "And you're not in this alone. We'll figure it out, no matter how messy it gets." For the first time since the funeral, Adalyn felt a flicker of hope ignite. The path ahead seemed daunting, but with Tessa by her side, it no longer felt impossible. Still, she knew Tessa was right. Richard was dangerous when cornered, and this battle would be anything but easy. As the call ended, Adalyn stepped outside onto the porch. The darkened skyline of Ashwood stretched before her, a blanket of stars twinkling faintly above. She wrapped her arms around herself, gazing up at the constellations her mother once loved. The fireflies had long since disappeared, but the memory of their glow lingered in her mind. The cabin wasn't just a place. It was a promise, a testament to her mother's enduring love and everything worth fighting for. The smell of freshly brewed coffee greeted Adalyn as she pushed open the door to Ashwood's cozy coffee shop. Inside, the warmth of the room contrasted with the sharp chill of the morning air, but it did little to ease the knot in her stomach. Heads turned briefly before darting away, conversations softening to whispers that made her skin prickle. The usual hum of familiarity in the small town felt like a thinly veiled judgment. Adalyn scanned the room, looking for a quiet corner to collect her thoughts. Instead, her eyes landed on a pair of women at the counter, leaning close over their steaming cups. Their voices carried just enough to reach her, despite their hushed tones. "Can you believe she's back?" one murmured, a spark of intrigue lighting her expression. "I heard she and that lawyer friend of hers are planning to sell the cabin for some quick cash." "Really? That cabin meant so much to her mother," the other replied, her tone teetering between doubt and condemnation. "What kind of person just flips something like that?" Adalyn's stomach twisted. She turned her back to them, feigning indifference, but the weight of their words clung to her. It wasn't just idle gossip. In a town as small as Ashwood, rumors spread faster than wildfire, and truth often became the first casualty. Sliding into a corner booth, Adalyn pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she navigated to her messages. She had barely opened Tessa's latest text when a familiar voice cut through the low buzz of the cafe. "Well, if it isn't Adalyn Harper," Eleanor Bradford said, her tone light but tinged with curiosity. The older woman, a pillar of the Ashwood community, carried her coffee cup with the ease of someone who belonged everywhere. Without waiting for an invitation, she slid into the seat across from Adalyn. Adalyn forced a polite smile, though her guard was already up. "I didn't expect to see you here, Eleanor." "Neither did I expect to see you," Eleanor replied, her sharp blue eyes studying Adalyn with practiced precision. "Word travels fast in a place like this. People are saying you're planning to sell the cabin." The bluntness of Eleanor's words hit like a slap, and Adalyn struggled to keep her composure. "I don't know who started that rumor," she said evenly, though her voice carried a slight edge. "But it's not true. That cabin is the only piece of my mother I have left. I'm trying to save it, not sell it." Eleanor raised a skeptical brow, her expression unreadable. "Saving it, huh? Then why does Richard say it's already been sold?" Adalyn inhaled deeply, steadying herself. "Because Richard doesn't care about the cabin. He sold it without my consent to cover his gambling debts. But the sale is invalid, Eleanor. Tessa and I are working to prove it." For a moment, Eleanor sipped her coffee in silence, her gaze distant, as if weighing Adalyn's words against the whispers she'd already heard. When she finally spoke, her tone was softer. "You always were honest, even as a kid. Maybe I judged too quickly this time." A flicker of relief passed through Adalyn. "Thank you for listening. That cabin isn't just some property to me. It's where I grew up, where my mother taught me the value of family. I won't let Richard take that away." Eleanor nodded, her gaze fixed on a point far beyond the cafe window. "Your mother was a good woman. If you're fighting for her memory, you'll have my support." Later that afternoon, Adalyn joined Tessa at the small desk crammed into the corner of her childhood bedroom, now repurposed as their makeshift war room. Legal documents, notepads, and sticky notes covered every available surface, a visual representation of the battle they were waging. "Tessa," Adalyn asked hesitantly, breaking the silence, "do you think I'm overreacting? Everyone in this town seems ready to believe the worst about me." Tessa didn't look up from her laptop, her fingers flying over the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "No, you're not overreacting, but small towns have a way of twisting stories. The best thing you can do is prove them wrong." Adalyn nodded, though the knot in her stomach remained. "What's the latest on the sale documents?" Tessa finally glanced up, her expression dark. "It's worse than I thought. Richard didn't just skip your consent. He altered the co-ownership agreement to make it look like he had full authority to sell. That's fraud, Adalyn." Anger flared in Adalyn's chest, sharp and consuming. "He forged my mother's legacy to cover his gambling debts." Her voice trembled with rage. "We have to stop him." Tessa closed her laptop with a decisive click. "We will, but you need to be prepared. Richard's not going to back down easily, and if his creditors are breathing down his neck, he's probably more desperate than ever." Adalyn exhaled, her resolve hardening. I don't care how desperate he is, he's not taking the cabin. Tessa reached over and squeezed her hand. Good, because we've got everything we need to fight this. As evening fell, Adalyn stepped onto the porch, the cool mountain air wrapping around her like a shroud. The treetops swayed gently in the breeze, their silhouettes sharp against the darkening sky. She closed her eyes, letting the memories of her mother flood her mind, her laughter, her warmth, the strength she embodied. Eleanor's words echoed in her mind. If you're fighting for her memory, you'll have my support. Adalyn knew she would need more than Eleanor's endorsement to win this battle, but it was a start. And in a place like Ashwood, where connections ran deep, sometimes a small start was all it took to ignite something bigger. Adalyn's grip tightened around the folder in her hands as she and Tessa approached the uneven steps of Richard's weathered porch. The house, much like its owner, bore the marks of neglect disguised under a thin veneer of pride. Paint flaked off the wooden panels and the porch sagged slightly, groaning under their weight as they climbed. The faint creak of the boards was a stark contrast to the heavy silence of the crisp mountain air, sharpening the tension that hung between them. Tessa knocked firmly, the sound echoing like a challenge. Her lawyerly poise was as unshakable as ever, while Adalyn stood beside her, battling the whirlwind of emotions threatening to spill over. Each knock seemed to summon not just Richard, but the memories of her mother that clung to the edges of her mind. The sound of her laugh, the warmth of her touch, the safe haven the cabin had once been. Those memories now felt sullied by the man who had betrayed them both. The door swung open abruptly, revealing Richard. His usual smug demeanor was dimmed, though not entirely extinguished. His shirt, once pressed, was now wrinkled, and his jeans looked hastily pulled on. The faint stubble on his chin and the shadows under his eyes hinted at sleepless nights. Yet he leaned casually against the doorframe, his lips curling into a thin, practiced smirk. "Well, if it isn't my favorite steps," he said, his voice coated with false charm. "What brings you two here? A social visit?" "We need to talk," Tessa said curtly, her voice firm enough to slice through the facade. Richard raised an eyebrow, his smirk deepening as he stepped aside. "By all means, come in. Let's get this over with. I'm a busy man." Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of cheap cologne and something acrid beneath it. The living room was cluttered, piles of papers and unopened mail spilling across the coffee table. Adalyn stood by the door, her eyes narrowing as Richard sank into an armchair with forced ease. Tessa took the seat opposite him, her briefcase snapping open with precision. "We're here about the cabin," Tessa began, her tone measured and sharp. "Your recent actions regarding the property are in direct violation of the co-ownership agreement." Richard leaned back, his hands lacing behind his head in a mockery of nonchalance. "You're making a fuss over nothing. It's done. The cabin's sold and the buyer's happy. You should be too." Adalyn stepped forward, her voice steady but edged with a quiet fury. "It wasn't yours to sell, Richard. That cabin wasn't just property. It was my mother's legacy, and you had no right." Richard laughed, the sound hollow and brittle. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "Oh, come on, Adalyn. You're never there. It's just sitting empty, collecting dust. I did you a favor. One day you'll thank me." "Thank you?" Her voice cracked, rising with the weight of her anger. "You sold my mother's memory to cover your gambling debts. Do you even hear yourself?" Tessa, maintaining her composure, pulled out the co-ownership agreement and placed it on the table between them. The agreement explicitly states that both owners must consent to any sale. Your name isn't on this document, Richard. The sale is invalid. For the first time, the cracks in Richard's armor became visible. His smirk faltered, and his hand reached instinctively toward the paper before stopping. He cleared his throat, his voice tightening. "Look, you don't understand. I didn't have a choice. Do you know the kind of people I owe money to? They're not exactly patient." Adalyn's gaze bore into him, her emotions threatening to erupt. "You didn't have a choice?" she spat. "You always had a choice, and every single time you chose yourself over anyone else." Richard's leg bounced nervously, betraying his feigned calm. He stood abruptly, pacing the room in uneven steps. "You think this is easy for me?" he snapped, his voice rising. "I was trying to fix things, to clean up my mess. I didn't mean for it to get this bad." "You didn't mean to?" Adalyn's voice cracked again, this time with the weight of hurt. She stepped closer, her hands trembling. "You spent years taking from my mother, from me, and now you've taken the last thing I had left of her. How dare you stand there and ask for sympathy?" Her words struck Richard like a blow. He stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping slightly as the weight of her accusations settled over him. For a moment, the room was filled only with the hum of the old refrigerator. Tessa broke the silence, her voice as cold and unyielding as stone. "This isn't about your debts, Richard. What you've done is illegal. The buyer can and will back out of the sale, and we will ensure they do. You can cooperate or you can face the consequences." Richard turned to her, his eyes darting between the two women. "You think you can scare me with your legal threats?" His voice shook, the bravado slipping further. "You don't know what I'm up against." "What you're up against," Tessa said, standing to meet his gaze, "is the law, and I promise you it's not something you can charm your way out of." Adalyn stepped beside her, her voice steady despite the storm raging within her. "This isn't a game, Richard. This is my mother's memory, and I won't let you destroy it." Richard's shoulders sagged, though his expression twisted into one last attempt at defiance. "Fine," he said, his voice bitter. "Do what you want, but don't think this is over." Adalyn met his gaze, unflinching. "You're right about one thing. This isn't over, but I promise you, I'll make it right." She turned and strode out of the house, Tessa close behind. The sharp chill of the evening air greeted them as they descended the creaking steps. Adalyn exhaled deeply, her breath visible in the cold, her resolve hardening with every step. "He's not going to make this easy," Tessa said quietly as they reached the car. Adalyn nodded, gripping the folder tightly. "He doesn't have to. We'll make it right." As she glanced back at the house, Richard's silhouette appeared in the window, shrouded in the dim light. Whether his gaze held regret, anger, or desperation, she couldn't tell. But one thing was certain. She was no longer the girl who had been pushed aside. This fight was hers to win. Adalyn was startled by the shrill ring of her phone cutting through the stillness of the night. The caller ID displayed a name she didn't recognize, James Cormack. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen before swiping to answer. "Miss Harper?" His voice was low and deliberate, tinged with uncertainty. "This is James Cormack. I'm the one who purchased the cabin." Adalyn's breath hitched. She hadn't expected to hear from the buyer directly, and her mind raced with questions. "Mr. Cormack, why are you calling?" James sighed, the weight of his emotions evident even over the line. "I've been doing some thinking. When I bought the cabin, I envisioned it as a place to rebuild something I lost, a home for my family to heal. But after hearing about the legal complications and your connection to the place, I realized maybe I acted too quickly." His voice softened, carrying a vulnerability that chipped away at Adalyn's initial defensiveness. She sat down, clutching the phone tighter. "I appreciate you reaching out. The cabin, it's not just a property. It's tied to my mother's memory, to everything she stood for." James paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I understand that better than you might think. My wife and I lost our daughter 2 years ago. She was only 8. The cabin reminded me of her. It felt like a place where we could start over, find some kind of peace. But I can't proceed if it means causing more pain for someone else. I'll hold off on the transaction until this is sorted legally." Adalyn closed her eyes, a wave of gratitude washing over her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. For the first time in weeks, she felt like the fight wasn't hers alone. Richard sat in the dimly lit corner of the town's bar, gripping his phone with white-knuckled hands. The conversation with his creditors replayed in his mind, each demand sharpening his desperation. Their patience had worn thin, and they had made it clear. Time was running out. He glanced at the crumpled note on the sticky bar top, James Cormack's number scrawled hastily in his own hand, his only lifeline. Bursting out the bar's door into the cold night air, he dialed. The call connected, and his voice was slick with forced calm. "Mr. Cormack, I think there's been some misunderstanding," he began. "I can assure you the sale of the cabin is completely above board. There's no need to delay." James's voice, resolute and calm, cut through Richard's veneer. "I've spoken to Miss Harper. Until the legal situation is clarified, I won't be moving forward. I'm not interested in getting entangled in a dispute." Richard's control cracked. "Do you understand what's at stake here?" he barked, his desperation spilling out. "You can't just back out like this." James's tone remained unmoved. "It's not my problem to solve, Mr. Kessler. Good night." The line went dead. Richard stared at the phone in disbelief before hurling it against the wall of the alley, the device shattering with a sharp crack. His breath came in heaving gasps. He could already feel the creditors' shadows closing in, their promises of consequences ringing in his ears. Panic clawed at his throat. He had no backup plan. The following morning, Tessa arrived at Adalyn's door, her briefcase in hand and a determined glint in her eye. "I've filed the cease and desist with the county," she announced, stepping inside. "That sale isn't going anywhere without our consent." Adalyn exhaled, relief mixing with the familiar tension of the fight ahead. "What about Richard?" Tessa smirked, pulling out a thick folder brimming with documents. "Turns out, our dear Mr. Kessler left quite the paper trail. I found emails where he blatantly misrepresented himself as the sole owner of the cabin. He also faked an addendum to the original co-ownership agreement. It's all here." Adalyn leafed through the pages, her anger reigniting with each damning line. "This has to be enough to stop him." "It's a strong start," Tessa said, her tone measured. "But we need to stay on guard. Desperate people do desperate things." That evening, Adalyn stepped into the local diner to grab a coffee, the warmth of the interior barely easing the chill in her bones. Her attention was drawn to a corner booth where Richard sat hunched over the table. His shoulders were stiff, his gestures sharp and jerky. Across from him were two men, their expressions cold and unyielding. Sliding into a booth at the opposite end of the room, Adalyn strained to catch snippets of their conversation. Richard's voice, usually polished and confident, wavered with frustration and panic. "I'm working on it. You'll get your money. Just give me more time." The men exchanged glances, their clipped responses inaudible but pointed. One of them leaned forward, his jaw tight as he spoke, the weight of his words pressing visibly on Richard. Adalyn's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about the cabin anymore. Richard had plunged into a web far darker than she had imagined. The stakes weren't just legal, they were dangerous. As she left the diner, the cool night air hit her like a slap, doing little to calm her racing thoughts. Standing under the pale glow of a street lamp, she pulled out her phone, scrolling to Tessa's number, but hesitated. The fight ahead felt heavier now, the weight of her mother's memory and Richard's crumbling world bearing down on her. Looking up at the darkened Ashwood skyline, Adalyn whispered a quiet vow into the still night. "For Mom, for me, this fight isn't over." Adalyn sat in the polished office of Evelyn Carter, the seasoned lawyer whose sharp eyes missed nothing. Shelves stacked with law books surrounded the three women, a fortress of legality that gave Adalyn a faint sense of security. Tessa sat beside her, arms crossed, exuding calm confidence as Evelyn laid out their strategy. "This cease and desist letter is airtight," Evelyn assured, sliding the document across the desk. "We'll file it with the county clerk first thing tomorrow. Richard won't be able to sell, lease, or touch that property until this is resolved in court." Adalyn nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Evelyn continued, "We'll also subpoena the buyers and demand any communications they've had with Richard. If he forged your signature, that's fraud. He won't be able to talk his way out of it." Tessa leaned forward, her voice steady. "And if he tries to ignore the cease and desist?" Evelyn smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hinted at unshakable confidence. "He won't. The penalty for defying it is steep enough to make even Richard Kessler think twice." Despite Evelyn's reassurance, a heaviness settled over Adalyn. She managed a weak smile as she thanked the lawyer, but her mind was already racing. The law was on her side, but Richard's unpredictability loomed over every step of this fight. As they left the office, the brisk evening air offered little relief. Her determination burned brighter, but so did the storm of emotions swirling inside her. That night, as Adalyn attempted to settle into a restless quiet, the sound of heavy knocking shattered the stillness. She froze, her heartbeat quickening. Tessa, who had insisted on staying over, glanced sharply at the door. "It's him," Adalyn murmured, her voice a whisper of dread. Tessa nodded, her face hardening. "Let's handle this." Adalyn opened the door to find Richard standing on the porch, his usually well-groomed appearance disheveled. The man who once prided himself on his charm now looked haunted. His eyes darted nervously, and his hands trembled at his sides. Shadows from the porch light exaggerated the lines of his face, making him look older, almost skeletal. "Adalyn," he began, his voice cracking. "I need to talk." Tessa moved to stand beside her, her stance protective. "This isn't the time, Richard." "I don't have time," he snapped, his voice rising before breaking into a pleading tone. "You don't understand what they'll do to me. I had no choice." Adalyn's stomach churned. His desperation hung in the air like a sour scent. "No choice?" she repeated, her voice cold. "You had a choice when you lied, when you forged my name, and when you sold the last piece of my mother's memory." Richard's face twisted, his anger slipping into desperation. He stepped closer, his voice trembling. "I made mistakes, all right? But it's not just me. They're coming for me. They don't care about your cabin or your memories. They want their money, and they'll get it one way or another." Adalyn stared at him, her chest tightening. For a fleeting moment, she saw past the manipulative man she despised to someone truly cornered, driven to desperation. But her anger surged again, fueled by the memory of her mother. "You mean to tell me you destroyed everything she built to save yourself? You betrayed my mother, Richard. You betrayed me. And now you're here asking me to save you?" Richard slumped against the doorframe, his bravado crumbling entirely. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad," he muttered, his voice barely audible. I didn't know what else to do." Tessa stepped forward, her tone icy. "So, your solution was to destroy Adalyn's life in the process? That's not gonna fly, Richard. You're out of options." Adalyn's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the door, her mind a chaotic swirl of pity, anger, and resolve. She had spent years resenting this man, but seeing him so broken stirred something unfamiliar, an ache that she didn't want to acknowledge. Yet the image of her mother's kind face, the warmth of their shared memories at the cabin, anchored her. "Richard," she said quietly but firmly, her voice steadying, "I'm not saving you. You're going to face what you've done, not just to me, but to her," Tessa added, her voice sharp as a blade. "If you don't retract the sale and come clean about the forgeries, we'll make sure the law handles it. You won't just lose the cabin, you'll lose what little reputation you have left." Richard looked between them, his bravado gone, replaced by raw fear. His lips quivered as he whispered, "You're really going to let them ruin me?" "No," Adalyn replied, her voice low and resolute. "You did that to yourself." The weight of her words seemed to crush him. He turned and shuffled off the porch, his shoulders hunched as though the fight had already drained out of him. As the door closed, Adalyn exhaled, her body trembling from the confrontation. Tessa placed a hand on her shoulder, her expression softening. "You did the right thing." Adalyn nodded, though the weight of the moment lingered heavily. The fight was far from over, but for the first time she felt the strength to see it through. She thought of her mother, her smile, her resilience. The cabin wasn't just a place, it was a promise, and Adalyn was determined to keep it. Adalyn sat by the window, the sprawling evergreens outside blanketed in mist from a recent rain. Her phone buzzed, cutting through the stillness, and she glanced at the screen. James Cormack. A lump formed in her throat as she answered. "I've thought about it," James began, his voice warm yet deliberate. "This cabin isn't just a piece of land, it's a piece of your soul. I'm officially withdrawing from the transaction." Relief washed over Adalyn, her shoulders slumping as the tension of the past weeks ebbed away. "Thank you," she said softly, the words catching in her throat. "You have no idea what this means to me." James chuckled faintly. "I think I do. I lost my daughter 2 years ago, and for a while I thought this cabin might help my family heal. But after hearing your story, I realized it's already part of someone else's healing. It belongs with you." The call ended, but James's words lingered, filling Adalyn with gratitude and a renewed sense of purpose. The cabin, her mother's legacy, was hers again. But the fight to rebuild was just beginning. The town of Ashwood began to stir with a new energy. Eleanor Bradford, who had once been a skeptical voice in the community, arrived at Adalyn's door carrying a bundle of old photographs and a determined smile. "Your mother," Eleanor said as she spread the pictures across the kitchen table, "was the heart of this community. That cabin wasn't just a home, it was a haven. Weddings, fundraisers, even baby showers were held there. People need to remember what's at stake." Eleanor's words were more than a sentiment. They were a call to action. Over the following days, neighbors who had once whispered rumors now came forward with stories of Adalyn's mother's kindness. Notes of encouragement began appearing on her porch along with homemade pies, flowers, and even offers to help restore the cabin. The acts of generosity were small, but they built into something bigger, a sense of unity that Ashwood hadn't felt in years. Meanwhile, Richard faced the consequences of his actions in a starkly lit courtroom. The bravado he once wore like armor was gone, replaced by a slumped posture and averted gaze. Accusations of fraud and misrepresentation filled the air, the weight of his choices pressing visibly on his shoulders. When it came time for his statement, Richard turned to Adalyn. His voice, though shaky, carried a rare sincerity. "I'm sorry," he said, his words halting and raw. "For everything. For your mother, for the cabin, for all the harm I caused." Adalyn sat stiffly, her hands clasped in her lap. The apology was long overdue, and she couldn't ignore the possibility that it was motivated by self-preservation. But as she searched his eyes, she saw something unfamiliar, genuine regret. With a deep breath, she nodded. "I accept," she said quietly, the words a release as much for herself as for him. Back at the cabin, the restoration began in earnest. Adalyn and Tessa threw themselves into the work, stripping layers of peeling paint, repairing broken window panes, and sanding the worn floorboards until they gleamed. The physical labor was exhausting, but with each repaired piece, the cabin seemed to breathe again, and so did Adalyn. On a crisp morning, Eleanor arrived with a small group of neighbors. Armed with tools, paintbrushes, and boundless enthusiasm, they transformed the restoration into a community effort. One neighbor recalled how the cabin had once hosted the town's Christmas parties, while another shared how Adalyn's mother had taken in their family during a storm. These stories wove together, creating a tapestry of memories that reinforced the cabin's significance. As the final touches came together, Adalyn unearthed a small, dust-covered box tucked away in the attic. Inside were letters written in her mother's elegant cursive. Each letter contained words of wisdom, encouragement, and love, as though her mother had anticipated the struggles Adalyn might face long after she was gone. One letter in particular brought tears to Adalyn's eyes. "My dearest Adalyn, life will challenge you in ways you can't foresee. When it feels overwhelming, remember this: you are stronger than you think, and you have a place in this world. Protect what matters most. Always with you, Mom." That evening, with the first snowfall of the season blanketing the ground outside, the restoration was marked by a symbolic act. Adalyn, Tessa, and the neighbors gathered near the cabin's porch to plant a young pine tree. The sapling's branches reached skyward, its roots anchoring firmly in the soil, a tribute to Adalyn's mother and a promise of renewal. As the group stood back to admire their work, Eleanor placed a hand on Adalyn's shoulder. "Your mom would be proud," she said softly. "She always believed in planting seeds for the future." The gathering stretched into the evening. Stories were shared, laughter echoed, and the warmth of the fireplace spilled out into the cold night air. The cabin, once quiet and empty, was alive again. When the guests had gone and the fire crackled low, Adalyn sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket. The newly planted tree stood tall in the moonlight, its leaves trembling gently in the breeze. She thought of her mother, of James's words, and of the journey that had brought her to this moment. "Tessa," Adalyn said, her voice soft but steady, "we've come so far, but there's still one last thing I need to do." Tessa raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. She knew Adalyn's journey wasn't just about the cabin. It was about reclaiming herself. Adalyn's gaze drifted to the mountains in the distance, their peaks bathed in moonlight. A smile curved her lips as she whispered, "This cabin isn't just a place, it's a promise, to honor her, to protect what matters most." For the first time, Adalyn felt not only a sense of closure but also a beginning. The cabin wasn't just her mother's legacy, it was her own. The early morning light spilled through the cabin's windows, casting a golden hue on the rustic wooden floor. Adalyn sat at the small desk by the window, her hand moving steadily across the pages of a letter. Outside, the forest stirred, the rustle of leaves and distant chirping of birds forming a peaceful symphony. She paused, gazing at the envelope marked with her mother's name before continuing to write, her words flowing like a quiet river. "Dear Mom, I hope you'd be proud of me. These past few weeks have been some of the hardest of my life, but they've also shown me the strength you always believed I had. I fought for what matters most, for this cabin, for your memory, for the values you taught me. I remember those summer nights on the porch, watching fireflies dance as you told me stories about the constellations. I remember how you'd hum to yourself while kneading dough in the kitchen, your laugh filling the room when I got flour everywhere. Those moments were more than just memories. They were lessons in love, kindness, and resilience. I promise to keep those lessons alive. This cabin will always be a sanctuary, a place for warmth, for family, and for new beginnings. Thank you for everything, Mom. I'll carry you with me always. Love, Adalyn." As Adalyn folded the letter and placed it into the envelope, she felt the weight of her grief shift. It was still there, but lighter now. No longer a burden, but a part of her story, a source of strength. Later that morning, the courtroom was quiet as the judge's gavel fell. Richard Kessler stood in the defendant's box, a shadow of the confident man he once was. His sentence was fair but firm: restitution payments to Adalyn and Tessa to cover their legal expenses, mandatory community service, and counseling. When the proceedings concluded, Richard turned to Adalyn. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice stripped of its usual bravado. His words were unadorned, carrying a sincerity she hadn't expected. Adalyn met his gaze, her emotions a mix of residual anger and surprising empathy. "I forgive you," she said softly. The words felt foreign but freeing. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't about absolving Richard. It was about letting go of the anger that had weighed her down. The afternoon brought life and laughter to the cabin as neighbors and friends gathered for a celebratory restoration. Eleanor Bradford stood near the fireplace, regaling the group with stories of Adalyn's mother. "She had a way of making everyone feel welcome," Eleanor said, her eyes misty. "This cabin wasn't just a house, it was the heart of this community." Adalyn smiled, watching as neighbors shared their own memories. One recalled a wedding held on the cabin's porch. Another spoke of a stormy night when Adalyn's mother had taken them in. Each story wove a tapestry of love and kindness, a testament to the legacy Adalyn was determined to preserve. Outside, Adalyn and Tessa worked with the neighbors to plant a young pine tree near the porch. As they lowered the sapling into the earth, Adalyn felt a surge of emotion. The tree, with its tender branches reaching skyward, was more than just a symbol of renewal. It was a promise. Eleanor placed a hand on Adalyn's shoulder. "Your mom would have loved this," she said softly. Adalyn nodded, her throat tight with gratitude. "She taught me to believe in planting seeds for the future. This feels right." As the golden sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, the gathering stretched into the evening. Old songs were sung, stories were shared, and the fireplace crackled warmly, spilling its glow across the room. The cabin, once quiet and lonely, was alive again. When the guests had left and the fire burned low, Adalyn lingered on the porch, wrapped in a blanket. The newly planted pine tree stood tall in the moonlight, its leaves swaying gently in the cool breeze. Adalyn gazed at it, her mind drifting to her mother, to James's words, and to the journey that had brought her here. In the tree, she saw herself, rooted, resilient, and growing toward something brighter. Her gaze shifted to the mountains in the distance, their peaks bathed in moonlight. A soft smile curved her lips. "This cabin isn't just a place," she whispered. "It's a promise to honor her, to protect what matters most, to always move forward." As she leaned back in her chair, the crisp night air wrapped around her, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of new beginnings. For the first time in years, Adalyn felt truly at peace. The cabin wasn't just her mother's legacy, it was her own. As Adalyn's journey comes to a close, we're reminded of the profound strength that comes from honoring our roots while forging a new path forward. This story speaks to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of forgiveness, and the importance of community. What would you fight for if it meant preserving a piece of your heart's history? How do you think acts of forgiveness like Adalyn's can help us heal in our most challenging moments? If this story touched your heart or made you reflect, leave a 1 in the comments, or let us know where you're watching from. Your voice matters, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and resonate. Together, we'll keep sharing the stories that remind us what truly matters. Thank you for being here. I can't wait to see you in the next video.